You're listening to the LRB podcast. I'm Thomas Jones, and I'm talking today with Peter Geoghegan, who has a piece in the current issue of the LRB, written with Lucas Amin, on the US tech giant Palantir and its contracts with British state institutions, in particular the National Health Service. Peter and Lucas both work for the investigative newsletter Democracy for Sale, which is also the title of one of Peter's books. Hello, Peter, and thank you so much for joining me.
Hello, Tom. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
I mean, I expect many, if not most, listeners would have heard of Palantir or Palantir. I don't even know how do you pronounce it? Palantir?
It's Palantir.
I mean, it's a made-up word, isn't it? So yeah, you can say however you like, Palantir. Well, no, it's a Silicon Valley firm that one of its founders, Peter Thiel, is a Trump supporter as well as a Tolkien fan, which is where the name comes from. But Palantir has a large NHS contract or contracts. There have been protests about that. And also perhaps that the Mayor of London recently blocked a £50 million deal between Palantir and the Metropolitan Police. But maybe, Peter, to get us started, you could take us back to the firm's origins 20-odd years ago, and then we can follow its path from Palo Alto to London via the CIA, GCHQ, and Peter Mandelson.
So Palantir today is an incredibly valuable company. It's worth about $325 billion as stock price. Like, that's a huge multiple of its earnings, about 150 times earnings. I think The Economist has called it the most overvalued company in the world. So, but it started in some ways more humble origins. It was actually, its first office was above a sushi restaurant in Palo Alto. And it was founded in 2003 by two people. Peter Thiel, who at that stage had already built PayPal. He'd done a lot of work with Elon Musk, was a very rich man. At this stage, Thiel was already a very important person in Silicon Valley. And he started Palantir with his former roommate from Stanford, Alex Karp. And the politics of it, I think, is there from the start, because Thiel is very, very outspoken libertarian throughout his entire time in university. He's involved with the Stanford Review, very much in the conservative wing of politics. Karp kind of styles himself as a Democrat, calls himself a socialist, and the two of them come together. And effectively, the idea behind Palantir, and the timing is really important, it's after 9/11, it's kind of in the early years of the war on terror. And what Palantir are thinking about and doing, these are two people who are kind of enmeshed in this world of Silicon Valley. And they're saying, look, there's a lot of data out there. The US government and its arms and its agencies have got huge amounts of data. And if you cast your mind back to 9/11, there was a lot of conversations afterwards, like, how did the US not find these people? How did they not know Mohammed Atta? How did they not know these people? How did they get in? All of these questions were there. And so Palantir in some ways is coming in the rush behind that and saying, well, actually, we can build software that allow agencies, particularly the military intelligence agencies in the military, to connect the dots between different people and to find them.
Because one of the things about 9/11, wasn't it, that the CIA knew some things, the FBI knew other things, that these different departments, and if they'd been able to pool the information, then maybe they'd have been able to stop it, was the idea.
Effectively, yes. And Palantir was saying, look, we're the people who can do that for you. And its early years are fascinating. They're funded effectively by the CIA's investment arm. They get contracts. The CIA basically is also their first big contractor. They do work for intelligence agencies. There's a lot of kind of hype around them, and this is again in the George Bush years where there's a lot of money floating around. Palantir bring in very, very, very kind of people like John Poindexter, ex-State Department, comes in as an advisor. They're politically connected. They're kind of been touted a lot as well, and they're quite good at hyping themselves, frankly. Max Chafin, I think, in his book The Contrarian about Thiel, does describe this really well, how Palantir in its early years was really able to hype itself really strongly. And it started getting a lot of contracts, and actually then started looking to try and expand into commercial areas. We got a contract with JP Chase. And as there was a lot of money floating around, Palantir, although the company was actually losing millions, a lot of investment money was coming in. There's a lot of interest in the company. But what's kind of interesting, what I found when I started going back into the kind of the archaeology of Palantir, because it's a company we hear so much about now, and so much of the reporting, it feels a bit like, is about the last couple of years under Trump, etc. And what's interesting is if you go back into the history of Palantir, it's not a history of unbridled success. It has a big boom in the years after 9/11, but it talks up a lot. The assassination of Osama bin Laden of Abbottabad, there's a lot of hype from Palantir internally about their role in this. That's pushed back, subsequently pushed back a lot by people in the intelligence agency, but they were saying, look, our ability to do this was really important. We were able to knit this information together. And so in that kind of world, Palantir is kind of seen as, it's been hyped up a lot. But by the kind of early years, by the kind of end of the 2000s, actually, they lose a contract with JP Chase. Other people are doing what they're doing better. It's not clear. There's a lot of basically the company seems to be, it's kind of in trouble really. And what happens is that they start to decide they want to expand out of the US because they've got a bit of a name in the US. And also the politics is changing. Obama's come in. The war on terror has been downgraded. The easy money that was there is gone. So they decide to move to Europe. As Chafin says in his book, Karp went to a place where Palantir's name wasn't known and neither was its failure. So they kind of they come into the US, from the US into Europe more. And the big play for Palantir, which has always been the big play, is government contracts. A lot of government contracts in the early years are in defence, but as they come into Europe and start to work in other places, they're looking to do data contracts in other places, health data, procurement data. In the UK, even they work for the Financial Conduct Authority now. So what the story of Palantir is, I think, in some ways, is this company's kind of early years it's not unbridled success, but it gives it the kind of the wast and the connections to then start moving into other spheres. At the same time, then as they're expanding into Europe, the politics of the US changes a lot, and I think Palantir have rode the politics of the last few years, very successfully. Their stock price has gone through the roof. Their Karp and Thiel have become very, very wealthy people, more wealthy than they were before, and their place in the kind of politics of the US, they're now very firmly a kind of an outrider, I think, of the Trump White House, of the MAGA movement, and I think that's been the big change over the last 20 years for them.
And David Runciman reviewed that biography of Thiel by Max Chafkin when it came out in 2021, and one of the things that he said, that one of the sort of contradictions of Thiel is that he presents himself as this sort of libertarian small government, and yet his business is entirely based on getting government contracts. That actually he needs a kind of big state. I mean, when people say small state, this kind of stop giving money to poor people and give it to me is sort of is what it really means. And then and they've given a lot of money to Trump campaigns, right? And so that ideologically established there, but they are still operating in London and operating in Europe. And so that move to London, it isn't as if they then went back to America once Trump got in.
No, they continued on working in the US, and I think, but what's happened in the US is their star has risen massively, especially under Trump. Under Trump 1, and more so even under Trump 2. So now Palantir it does a lot of work for ICE. It does a lot of predictive policing work. It also does a lot of work. It's very, very pro-Israel. It does work with the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, work with the Israeli Ministry of Defense. It's been accused of being involved in targeting in Gaza. It denies this, but it's been accused of human rights abuses around that. It's become, I think, a big culture war play. It's also become a meme stock. That's the reason it makes so much money, is that it has created this self-image as this malevolent organization, as this kind of malevolent force. And that's really, it's a bit like Elon Musk and Tesla. It's very similar. It's a lot of hype. There's a huge amount of hype behind Palantir. And one of the things I was kind of keen to do with this piece is try and unpick the hype, because Palantir is a software company. It talks a lot about AI, drone warfare. It talks a lot about defending the US state. It talks about civilizational battles. But it builds software. It doesn't have a foundational frontier model like Anthropic or OpenAI. It doesn't build hardware. It's not BAE Systems. It's not Lockheed Martin. It's not SpaceX even. It is a software company. And I think one of the things I was trying to do with this was to try and kind of get behind the hype a bit, because the hype is really important to understanding why Palantir is so valuable. Actually, it's a political meme stock. But what exactly does it do? What does it build, and how does it work?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that is the question, and I mean, the hype is part of the way, as you lay out in the piece, as you and Lucas lay out in the piece. The hype is one of the ways that they do business, right? They get the contracts because the hype helps them get the business. So when they came to London, 2015, 2016?
They'd been in London from around. They'd had actually, and Lally Khalili's written about this in the LRB previously. They had contracts they had some work with GCHQ back in the late 2000s, but they kind of, they opened their office in London in the late 2000s. But I think it's fair to say it's only around 2014, 2015 that they really start properly having a footprint in the UK. They hire Louis Mosley, who's a conservative. He actually used to work for Rory Stewart. He was a Conservative councillor. He's the grandson of Oswald Mosley. They hire him to head up the firm. That's in 2016. They start doing something which I write a lot about in this piece, which is they start hiring people from government pretty quickly too, which is very much the model they use in the US. So in the US, what they did was they had not just John Poindexter, James Carville, the kind of raging Cajun, someone by him, Bill Clinton's former advisor, disgraced Trump General Mike Flynn, other people. They had this, and a lot of lobbyists working for them. And they used a very similar playbook in the UK, where they started, they're not the only company that does this, but I do think they took a very American approach to expansion and to kind of understanding. I think almost more than most, especially most startups, I've ever seen, Palantir really understood the value of political connections.
And one of those connections was Peter Mandelson. So how does he fit into all this?
Yeah, so interesting. The two companies have a kind of similar trajectory, actually. Interesting. Mandelson's company, Global Counsel, which is his lobbying firm, which Mandelson set up in 2010, just as he was leaving government. So around the same time as Palantir arrived in London, Global Counsel are trying to expand and trying to get a foothold in what's quite a crowded market. They didn't describe themselves as a lobbying firm. They called themselves an advisory firm, selling advice. And they're trying to expand. They're trying to get a foothold in the London market at the same time as Palantir has been set up in London. And we know a lot about Global Counsel now because of the Jeffrey Epstein emails. The Epstein emails between Mandelson and Epstein actually talk a lot about Global Counsel. And we can see that Epstein was very involved in the early years of Global Counsel. At one stage, in its early years, Epstein's secretary was even printing off the pitch decks for Global Counsel ahead of meetings. And Mandelson's asking for advice from Epstein about Global Counsel. When all of this emerged earlier this year, Global Counsel announced that it was closing. It's now in administration. And actually, when I was writing this piece, I approached their administrators, but I never heard anything back because Global Counsel doesn't exist anymore. But at the time, around the mid-2010s, Global Counsel is trying to find clients, and actually, to be honest, it's struggling. And Mandelson complains a lot to Epstein about this. It's got some clients. It's got Oleg Deripaska, who's now a massively sanctioned Russian oligarch. Uber is an early client. Vodafone are working for it. But don't have that many clients. And then Palantir come along. Palantir become a client in around 2018. And effectively, Palantir hired Global Counsel to kind of change their image vis-a-vis the British government, because they're seen as as an extension of the CIA still, and that's not great for business. So Palantir hired Global Counsel. It was researching this piece, I was able to speak to quite a few former Global Counsel people, so we were able to put a lot more flesh on the bones of what this looked like. They were paying Global Counsel a retainer of at least £30,000 a month. And actually, inside Global Counsel, the Palantir contract was so secretive, it had its own code name. They called it Project Onion. So there's only certain people were able to be involved in it. And it made, basically, Palantir was probably the biggest global client contract at the time. Peter Mandelson was very interested. If you talk to former Global Counsel staff, to say, look, some companies we had, he wasn't that interested. Global Counsel, he was really interested. And what they were able to do effectively was to take advantage, is a generous reading of Britain's lobbying laws, because under the lobbying laws in the UK, you have to register as a lobbyist, as what's called a consultant lobbyist, if you contact a government minister on behalf of a specific client with a specific request. What Global Counsel were doing was they would do things like they put on a dinner or a lunch, say, to discuss tech and healthcare. And they would invite senior politicians, they'd invite senior policymakers, because Peter Mandelson's Rolodex was big, and they had other very well connected people in Global Counsel. And they would also invite senior Palantir people. So you get to meet the ministers, you get to meet the policymakers, and as we can see through to disclosures, you can just email them directly then. So there's no lobbying taking place. So none of this lobbying was declared. And actually, I was able to find out that Palantir was declared as a Global Counsel client back in 2022, belatedly, because of a junior mistake. A junior person sent an email they shouldn't have sent to a senior official. So they declared them very briefly and then stopped declaring them again. But what Palantir was able to get from Global Counsel was really good connections into politicians and into understanding the world of UK politics. And Palantir's expansion in the UK is often put down just to COVID. Like the COVID happened, Palantir came in, they offered to work for free for the NHS to build this NHS data store. And then they started getting government contracts. And there's definitely truth to that. That's what's called this land and expand strategy. So you do something for free, you build all these flashy dashboards. And we know that the politicians like the flashy dashboards, so you get more contracts.
So it's what drug dealers do, right? You get your first fix for free.
There's a little There's a little bit of the wire running across this whole story, frankly. There's definitely elements of the wire. You get somebody in early, and you get them used to your product. The product is something that is definitely a wire phrase. But what's interesting as well, if you kind of drill into it, is actually Palantir's expansion was already starting to happen before COVID, and they had these kind of political links. But COVID definitely supercharged it and brought Palantir, I think, really into government's orbit in a way it hadn't been before. And I think it was an opportunity that they were very keen to seize on.
But it did have these earlier contracts, not with the Ministry of Health, right? There was one with the Ministry of Defence or with DCHQ, but their first one, it was quite small. It was, $750,000, which is a lot of money to me or you, but not so much to them. And then they got one with the Ministry of Defence, right? Some naval personnel management system. And so they moved their way sort of as they were homing in on the NHS as the big prize.
Yeah, I think that's very fair to say. You start picking up contracts and you start to build, because I think David Runciman's completely right that it is an irony of Teal that it is a public procurement machine. Really, Palantir has private contracts too, but really the bulk of its work is public contracts, and it's looking for returnable public contracts. And the NHS was something, and there's two reasons I think Palantir was very interested in the NHS. One is as a government contract, and also it is a company that's interested in data. It is a company that's interested in obtaining access to large amounts of data. So the NHS, something that Teal has been on the record, is fair to say he's not a fan of free at the point to use healthcare. It's something that is politically anathema to him, but it's a very attractive data set. The NHS data set is probably the most complete health records in the entire world. The closest equivalent in the US is veterans data, which is by its very nature actually, it's very detailed, but it is a very specific subset of the population, whereas the NHS crosses the population. And what happens is, so back when COVID starts, about 30 different tech firms are called in to the Cabinet Office under Boris Johnson, the then Health Secretary Matt Hancock, to try and, they call it a digital Dunkirk. What are we going to do? How can we deal with this crisis that's unfolding in front of us? And we have a lack of data. And there's a history of the history of the NHS is the history of failed data projects. It's probably worth saying for a moment as well. There was a massive, especially under Tony Blair, there was a huge project to try and bring together all the NHS data in one place. It was called the National Programme for Information Technology. And it was a disaster. It cost over £12 billion. And the Public Accounts Committee called it one of the worst and most expensive contracting fiascos in the history of the public sector. So there's a long history of problems with data in healthcare. And so Palantir come in for free. They start working on building dashboards to help with figuring out where hospital beds are free during COVID, etc. 6 months later, they get a chunky contract worth a couple of tens of millions. They get another contract. But the big thing at the background is the NHS for a long time has been talking about trying to systematize its data, trying to bring it all into one place, because one of the issues is it's a bit like, we hark back to the American data before 9/11. It's in different places. NHS data sits in different places, in trusts and hospitals and pharmacies and doctors all over the place. How do you bring it all together? And so the idea was they would create what's called the Federated Data Platform, the FDP. And what I think was really significant was this was kind of happening towards the end of COVID, because COVID had kind of shown that there was a real problem here. And the big focus, I think, for Palantir and for Global Counsel on this was positioning Palantir around this, and especially around this tendering process. Because the real, and I write about this not just in the context of Palantir, but other stories too. When it comes to procurement, rarely do you see contracts. It does happen sometimes, but it's very rare you see contract processes that, someone is told you must choose this person. The contract is tendered and there's an award that's effectively corrupted. The real play with influence is influencing the tender process, influencing the writing of the tender, because the writing of the tender often dictates who will actually get it. So in this case, the tendering process, when the tender comes out for the FDP, the tender for the FDP comes out in probably, I think it's around 2022. And when that comes out, it's very clear, Palantir are already kind of seen as the front runner. They've hired a bunch of people from the NHS, from NHS Digital around the same time. So they're very well connected. But also NHS officials are actually using Palantir's own slogans. They're talking about creating a single source of truth with this FDP. That's literally a Palantir slogan.
I mean, it's also I would just quickly about that. I mean, it is also. Like Palantir build it into some other bigger idea of truth, but it is a data systems phrase. I think single source of truth. The idea, and in a way, it sounds. The way Palantir uses it, Palantir, it's a crystal ball from the Lord of the Rings, and they single source of truth, like Sauron looking into his crystal ball. But it is also used less ideologically or whatever, or more straightforwardly. Just if you have a lot of computers pulling data from lots of different places, then if you have a single database where everything is pulled from, that's your single source of truth, and that's it has a kind of mundane sense as well, which maybe maybe if it was single source of information, it would be a better phrase. But yeah,
I think there's some. I think that's fair as well. I think there's an element in which Palantir are able to lean into the kind of wider conversation around, and that's what they're selling basically. Is we're going to put all this data together, but there's also other aspects of it too, like the tender itself actually describes products. It actually uses pictures of Palantir's own software with Palantir's logo blanked out. It describes features that Palantir already produces. It's even talking to people in Global Council. They were talking about like how the influence play was around this tendering process. And we talked to somebody actually for the piece, a guy called Shane Tickell, who was on a rival bid. And he sums it up. He kind of says, look, Palantir had all the people who were able to open all the doors. It wasn't anything illegal. It's great selling. It's using your influence. And so when the tender comes out, Palantir are widely seen as the people who are most likely to get it. And there's a lot of pushback against that. There's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of unhappiness both in the GP world, in the medical world, but also in the wider kind of political world about this. And one of the interesting things is, because of the pushback, the contract is given to Palantir, but there's more stipulations put into it than I think would normally be put into the contract if it wasn't for Palantir. So, for example, GP data isn't included in the FDP. So the FDP doesn't include GP data. And I think that's one of the issues as well, is that by having such a politically contentious firm like Palantir delivering this contract, even no matter how mundane the IT contract might be, I think almost any contract, the politics of it start to bleed into Palantir even quite early. And this is, before it's even been rolled out.
And that's a really strong argument against it, right? Because if GP data is not included, then you don't have a single source of truth. So the whole sort of aim of the purpose of bringing it all into one place is already not happened. It's still fragmented. The problem that Palantir was brought in to solve, or got the contract to solve, is a problem that needs solving. That you had all this huge, ever more amounts of health data, and if there were one place where every time you went to the GP and you got a referral and you got a prescription, and all that data was in one place, and any doctor you see, they can immediately put up on their screen everything they need to help you, then records are less likely to get lost. Mistakes are less likely to be made. Lives will be saved at the end of the day. I mean, the well-organized data, in theory, can save lives, and that's the problem that they were coming in to solve. But plot spoiler, that isn't what happened.
Yeah, it's quite striking actually. One of the things we found, and one of the genesis of the story, was actually just talking to NHS data analysts who were complaining about two things. One is the problems that they had with the FTP, and we kind of go through them in the piece. And one of the big problems is the federated data platform is built on Foundry, which is Palantir's proprietary software. It's one of Palantir's softwares, and Foundry is used in different places. And Palantir's big. It's worth kind of mentioning that kind of Palantir's big in innovation in the space in general, in the tech space, is actually in some ways not really tech. It's what they call forward engineers. And a forward engineer is somebody who goes and works for your company. If you get Palantir's product, forward engineers then go and work alongside you for a period of time. And the forward engineer is effectively there, kind of supposed to be troubleshooting with you. And the forward engineer is incredibly expensive. It's probably in general around $500,000 a year for a forward engineer for a company, and Palantir probably pay them roughly half of that. So there's a big profit margin for Palantir in this, and that's kind of a big part of their model. But one of the challenges with the NHS is both its size. It's a very, very large organization, but also because it's proprietary software, like it's Foundry, it's proprietary software. It's very one size fits all. And so it's very Palantir, I think, is like Foundry is very useful for actually quite a few things. Like, it's a decent piece of tech kit. If what you're doing is reasonably structured data. If you're, as one person who used to work very senior in the NHS said to me, if you're making widgets, it's great. It'll help you make widgets, no problem. The problem with this data, it's all disparate, is it's not just in disparate places, but it's held in different ways and says different things. Some of it's quantitative, some of it's qualitative. Some of what it's measuring is different. It's very, very spread out. And Foundry effectively is a kind of platform that sits on top and sucks all this data in, and kind of has to try and pull square pegs through round holes for that reason. So it often just doesn't do the things that people want it to do. It's quite good at doing basic stuff, but for more complicated things, and for analysis in particular, a lot of people find it just doesn't really do the job all that well. And so what you've got is this proprietary software, and you're constantly having to ask Palantir to kind of try and edit it. So data analysts and technicians are constantly kind of going to Palantir, can we do this, can we do that? And there's an interesting bit in the piece. We got access to an NHS builders forum, so like an online forum, a troubleshooting forum where NHS technicians go and ask like Palantir for help. And this got one technician's asking for help about a product, and he waits a week and there's no response from Palantir. And he posts a GIF of a tumbleweed, and there's still days go by and there's no more response. So his other technicians start piling in and start like posting pictures of Mr. Bean and a dog looking out the back of a car window with GIFs. So yeah, that's one. So there's a kind of, even just the proprietariness of the software makes it quite unwieldy for some of the things people need to do with it.
Because if they were using instead some form of open source software, which does exist, right, and other places, other countries use open source, then you wouldn't need Palantir's permission to change the code or to do whatever you want with it. The whole point of open source is you take it and it's free and you do what you like with it.
Yeah, and it also, the other challenge is that it's not like the nature of data in the health service is very, very disparate and patchy, but it's also a bit like William Gibson, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. Because what you have is some NHS trusts are really quite advanced. They've built their own bespoke technology. It seems to work very well for them. They've got relationships with their users and with the local health community. It means they actually are able to use GP data and lots of other types of data. And they've built quite sophisticated systems, which frankly, they will argue and they say that they are much more sophisticated than the FDP, so they don't really use the FDP. And some trusts have actually been very weak and haven't done very much at all. And it looks as if those trusts have had a gain from using Foundry. They've been able to use it. It's probably improved their data systems. But for a lot of trusts, it hasn't. And one of the things that we did was really kind of drill down into the numbers, because the NHS England has really pushed the uptake of Palantir. It's actually been paying KPMG. KPMG is an £8.5 million contract just to promote the FDP. And trusts have actually been able to get, as well as the £330 million contract, individual trusts have been paid. You know, Chelsea and Westminster, which is kind of a flagship for Palantir, they were given £3 million to increase their uptake. So it's fair to say that the headline figure of 330 million actually isn't the true cost of the FTP product. It's more than that. But what we found was, if you drill into the figures from the NHS, you know, they will say that basically 64% of trusts are live on Palantir's FDP. But what does live mean? If you look into how often they've logged on to the apps, the Palantir apps, often they've only been a handful of times. Take Cancer 360, which is this app. It's supposed to help increase diagnosis of cancer, and Keir Starmer hailed it as groundbreaking in the Commons last year. That only 6 trusts have logged into that in the last year. And it's not just us who are asking questions about this, actually. The UK Statistics Authority very recently said that it's going to start, it's opened an investigation into NHS England over the potential misuse of data to promote the FDP. So the statistics regulator is basically asking is this data that the NHS is citing, is it really accurate? And that is the data the NHS basically used to justify the project.
And I mean, we've been talking about trusts in the sense of NHS trusts, but in the sort of more abstract sense, there is a problem of trust here, right? And one of the reasons I'm assuming that GP data is not included is because, you know, your personal medical records are about the most private thing there is. There is patient confidentiality. There are all these questions. And so the idea of handing over the most personal information about how many people use the NHS in England, 50 million people, to a Silicon Valley tech firm that's funding Trump. I mean, there are clearly privacy concerns about this. And the previous, as you say in the piece, that the previous attempt to centralise and share patient records electronically that was known as care.data collapsed because it turned out that the Department of Health and Social Care had sold the records of 47 million patients to an insurer, as you put it. So, in that question, I suppose the big question that everyone who uses the NHS will have is my private personal medical data safe?
That, I think, that's a huge part of I think that's a huge part of the issue, I think, with Palantir and the NHS. And I think there's been a kind of, we shouldn't politicize this. Palantir's politics have got nothing to do with its product, etc. But I think it has done because it's affected trust. It's affected, genuinely people's kind of engaged willingness to share their data with them. There's been huge concerns about it. And just last month, Preet Gill, who's one of the health ministers in the government, she had to apologise after NHS England failed to disclose that some Palantir staff have unlimited access to identifiable patient information while working on part of the FTP. So these are it's not as if it's a perfect system that there's no issues with. And I think that is a big part of it. And if you look, we got documents from within NHS England correspondence amongst kind of senior NHS leaders, and they are talking about the fact that one of the biggest risks from the FTP is that people won't trust Palantir with their data. And Palantir will say, look, that's because of campaigners, the Good Law Project is cited, and others who've kind of created a misinformation, they will say, about the product. But that pushback against Palantir is partly a product of Palantir's own business and what Palantir has done and how Palantir talks about the world. I think that's a really significant part of it too. If you look at that tweet thread that Palantir put out back in April, which is effectively a praise of Alex Karp's book, in which they talk about how some cultures are regressive and how Palantir's role is to help defend the US in an age of AI-driven warfare. That is not the kind of language you would expect from a company that's looking after your health data.
Yeah, I have heard, this is very anecdotally, but one cancer researcher who is relatively positive about what you can do with the Palantir software. They says, actually that ability to process the data and, I don't understand the work they do, but that, relatively positive about the software. But then they said almost immediately, having been, so we need the software, but we should get it from somewhere else. That was the thing. It's kind of, there is the need for the software. It's quite good at what it does, but we should be getting it from a different source.
And I think that's the thing with Palantir, is because I think there's a bit of a conflation, which I tried to tread through the piece, because Palantir present as this bombastic, almost eschatological company that's at the cutting edge of everything, and at the cutting edge of a massive culture war, a cutting edge of a future, an AI-driven future, a cutting edge of MAGA, a cutting edge of a political zeitgeist. And the likes of you and I, Tom, are living in the past in every sense. Talking about a long piece that appears in a printed paper with no pictures, not written by AI, all of this stuff, that even the conversation we're having could be AI generated and we could go and do something else with our morning. And so that's the kind of position that they present. And it's one of the reasons why the stock is so popular, frankly. It's in some ways a MAGA meme stock. But the reality of their software, of what they actually do, is so different. They don't, as I mentioned earlier, they don't build things. They're not at the cutting edge of AI. Yeah, they use some AI in their products, but it's effectively a software company. And on US online forums, Palantir is described as evil Salesforce, in reference to Salesforce, the US company that kind of is ubiquitous, but no one really knows what it does. And there's definitely an element of that. If you want another slightly MAGA billionaire who isn't quite as vocal, I guess, as Thiel and Karp, you could have Larry Ellison's Oracle, which kind of does something very similar. Or you could explore open source options. I think that's the thing that becomes conflated, I think, is this, they're evil geniuses. And I've heard this when talking to people in government. There's a kind of line of, these guys are so evil, they must be great. And I cite James Ball, a good piece of James Ball, the tech writer, wrote in Transformer about Palantir, about basically saying like this is pretty mundane software, and the kind of self-image, this malevolent, nefarious self-image, is actually quite a good mask, because instead of talking about what Palantir does, is it value for money, like the kind of nuts and bolts of it, you end up having kind of a version of a conversation around where do you think, the ethical conversation I think is real, but it also ends up in a place where, like, say in the UK media, I think it's been really interesting over the last 6 months or so, where the Telegraph, the Times have become really stalwart defenders, to an incredible extent, of Palantir. And others on other sides of politics have come to the opposite place on it. But rarely are we talking about its actual products. We're almost always talking about this kind of self-image.
Yeah, I mean, David Runciman in that review of the biography said that Thiel comes across as like a cross between Joe Pesci and Goodfellas, a man who will stab you in the eye with a ballpoint pen if you cross him, and Richard Branson, another so-called entrepreneur who makes most of his money by capturing state-controlled contracts. And in a way, I mean, the Joe Pesci side is more headline grabbing and all the rest of it, but in a way, the problem is the Branson side. Virgin Trains and all the rest of it. These the vast amounts of public money are given to private enterprises who claim they can do the job better, and maybe if you just spent the money on cut out the middleman and spent the money on what you needed, it would be better.
And there's the big issue at the heart of this as well, as I mentioned before, the proprietary software, but what we call vendor lock-in, and this is a big issue, and it's where, because it's proprietary software, the FTP, all this work is done on the FTP. If we were to no longer license Palantir in the NHS, and it's not just the NHS, it's the MOD. The MOD actually has acknowledged this recently, because Palantir now has a lot of big MOD contracts. It's actually got more contracts with the MOD than it does with the NHS now. It's become a big player in the MOD, and that looks like it's going to increase, not decrease. We're basically locked into their systems, and moving off those systems then becomes very, very, very hard. And we're back to the drug dealer analogy. You're in there, you like it, you've got your taste. Okay, it's not great, you're not feeling great all the time, but you need it. And so this is kind of the problem where you end up with, where you're locked into these systems and processes, and it feels a bit like the politics of this, and I think it's also like it's changed a lot since the contract came out. We now talk about British tech sovereignty. We now talk about trying to wean ourselves off Silicon Valley. A lot of other countries, but we've not done much about it in the UK, frankly, but a lot of other countries are starting to make moves. The French security service have said they're not going to work with Palantir. The Dutch, the Danes have all started moving away. There was a court case a quite high profile court case in Switzerland. The Swiss government and security service in Switzerland decided not to use Palantir. And a small independent journalism outfit, not actually unlike Democracy for Sale in some respects, called Republic in Switzerland, they got the documents behind us and they published them. And Palantir sued them under Swiss laws. It wasn't a defamation case. They sued them because they said they hadn't been given a fair right to reply. And there was 23 counts against Republic, and Palantir lost 22 of them. So it's quite an embarrassing loss for Palantir. But I think it also shows the extent to which Palantir are worried now, and they're worried that their business model, in some ways the politics, there could be a turning point, there could be a pivot coming where the politics of Palantir is now starting to damage the actual business. The stock might still be a meme, but there might come a time when if you start losing serious amounts of public contracts, well, what is your business?
But if the British government did decide to follow those other European governments and step away from Palantir, how would it go about it? Because, I mean, as you say in the piece, that if this data is stored, I mean, in that way that you can't open a file for one that's made for one piece of software, you can't open that in a different piece of software. If these are all Palantir files, that if you don't renew the contract or you end the contract, then you have all this data that you can't then read. I mean, that's a real problem, right? So how do you extricate yourself from it?
It is genuinely a real problem. I think it is properly a problem, and we've now ended up where the politics has got really far ahead of the tech side of it. So even as I was writing this piece, not one but two select committees in Westminster, the Health Select Committee and the Science and Technology Select Committee, both came out and said that we should exercise this, what we call a break clause with Palantir next year, which would effectively end the contract. And this is unusual to have two select committees be quite so vocal about this. And so the politics now, I think, is very, very much against Palantir and the NHS in general. It doesn't mean they can't survive it, but there's a headwind against it. But the question about what would replace it, so other countries have used open source software. Germany does, Finland does. Lots of different regions that use it too. So there is alternatives from talking to experts, but you would have to. There would be a job of work of transferring all of this and migrating all of this. So it's not an easy thing to do, and to do it, there's an inflection point that's coming. If it hasn't arrived, it will arrive very soon. 2027 isn't that far away, and in some ways it feels as if.
And is that when the contract expires?
That's when the break clause
expires.
Yeah,
right,
it's when the break clause would be if it was to be exercised. And it feels like NHS England has put so much political capital, and its leadership have put so much political capital into pushing through the FDP, into making the FDP a flagship thing, that there's not been a hell of a lot of thought about what would replace it. And similarly in government, I think it's going to be a big test for Andy Burnham, because the previous health secretary, Wes Streeting, was very bullish on American tech, frankly, and was, I think, very bullish on Palantir, and spoke highly of the company, and belatedly kind of started talking about ethical issues with it, but generally is very bullish on it. If that was to change, I think it's a big job of work, and it would require somebody who was willing. It would take money, frankly. It would take quite a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask, what, if anything, is likely to change once Andy Burnham's in number 10? It sounds like not a lot would be your answer.
I actually wouldn't know the answer to that side of this question. I think it's a very, very live question. I think it's a big. A couple of weeks ago, there was a piece in the Telegraph saying that Andy Burnham was going to ditch Palantir, and it was a fascinating piece of journalism in that there was no direct quotes from anybody in Andy Burnham's camp. The lines from his supposed allies came 6 or 7 paragraphs into the story. And on the back of it, the Telegraph ran a series of editorials about Palantir and how great they are. There was pieces about the Tories criticising Labour for ditching Palantir. But actually, Burnham's camp, and interestingly, other people didn't pick up on the story. It didn't run, because Burnham's camp, as I understand it, distanced themselves from it massively. So it does feel like it's a decision that hasn't been taken. But I think it's one that's going to become is a very live one, and isn't something, because of these select committees and the timing of that. I think it's in some ways by coincidence. Really, it is something I think he's going to face a big issue on, and is something, if he was to decide to keep a Palantir, that is a statement in itself. I think inaction is also a statement in now, whereas, had it been a different place a few years ago, I think he could have said, "Look, it wasn't me who did it. I've just come in. There's lots of other stuff I have to deal with." But actually, this is a decision he has to make, because there is this potential break.
And also, he can't say that anyway, because, I mean, in a way, that's one of the things that Starmer tried, and it's politically unacceptable. People, the electorate aren't going to accept that.
No, it is. It's politically unacceptable for him to say, "Look, I haven't done anything with it." So I think I have no intel on it. But I think it's going to be one to really watch.
Yeah, and is it going to make any difference who the new health secretary is?
I think it will, because if you talk to the kind of people we spoke to for this piece, some of whom were speaking honestly, some of whom are on the record in the piece, what they are kind of citing is that's is effectively almost a version of what Andy Burnham was talking about. Because if you think about Palantir as an attempt at centralisation. And we were a very centralised state, and effectively what Palantir's FDP is an attempt to really centralise all this health data. And the kind of open source people and the other people in that world will say, actually, that's not what we need to do. We need to make it speak to each other, which is not the same as centralisation. It's not the same as bringing it all together in one place. And Burnham is talking about devolution. That is his big pitch. And there's a world in which, the likes of Leeds, the likes of Manchester, these are trusts that have privately said the functionality is just way worse than Palantir. It's just a real downgrade, so we're not using it. So for them, that's a kind of model of a version of Burnhamism, if that's what it is. It's a model of devolution. It's a model of decentralisation. It's a model of saying, actually, maybe the answer to everything in Britain isn't more centralisation. Maybe the answer is spreading things out. Maybe it is. and connecting things in that way. And which is what other countries do. Like, it's not like Germany doesn't have one massive centralized database. That is completely anathema to Germany. Like, Germany's got really strong data laws that they would never run a system like that. So there is alternatives. So I think, I don't know if Burnham's thinking like this, but there is a political play here as well that's kind of interesting, that's speaking to this idea of a shared goal, but different ways of getting there and different things looking in different parts of the country.
I mean, that sounds almost hopeful.
Sometimes you got to be hopeful.
Peter Geoghegan, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom.
You can read Peter Geoghegan and Lucas Amin's piece in the 23rd of July issue of the LRB, along with Ray Monk on Einstein, David Runciman on gerontocracy, Jonathan Coe on Hitchcock's music, and Rebecca Solnit on America before 1776. The LRB podcast is produced by Anthony Wilkes. I'm Thomas Jones. Thank you for listening.